here's a picture of David Graham. We have David Graham here today. And David Graham is a writer, a staff writer for the Atlantic magazine. He's previously covered politics. He worked for Newsweek, Wall Street Journal, The National. He won for his coverage of the 2020 presidential election, the 2021 Turner Prize for Excellence. He's currently an adjunct instructor of journalism and public policy at the DeWitt Center for Media and Democracy at Duke University. Now, what we're going to talk about tonight is Project 2025, but also the genealogy of it, the origins of it. And I just wanted to put it up because I remember they're not actually allowing you to download the PDF anymore. That's sort of interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, they said, oh, too many people reading it. This, of course, is Kevin Roberts of the Heritage Foundation, who was very important and instrumental in this. And we'll talk a little bit later about Paul Dans, who's also instrumental in it. He was in charge of it. And then, of course, Russell Voigt, who is now the director of the OMB. The project itself, this is a book, very easily read synopsis in 160 pages. Did you do this?
Yep.
Yeah, of the ideas that were argued in Project 2025. I also should note, for those of you who want more Project 2025 material, in August of last year, training videos were released by ProPublica. And it turns out that what we saw in those training videos was actually a introduction, a weeding process, which was then followed by more Project 2025 universities, which we haven't seen the actual information about. But Project 2025 has reached the comic book scene, the cartoon scene. So here we have We the People, the Constitution with Project 2025 in there. We have, of course, basically the Oscars. You can see RFK Jr. There's Russell Voigt, Donald Trump as Godfather 2, and Elon Musk. And then we have, this is an interesting one. I thought I got a kick out of this. Project 2025, the only book you need, Christian nationalism. And then you have the issue that we didn't see in Project 2025, which we're going to talk about, and that is Elon Musk and his effect. And then, of course, you have, they're just going nuts with the cartoons about this. But it reaches the issue of, the famous play by Sinclair Lewis, It Can't Happen Here. Are we indeed seeing American-style fascism or what? Now, I wanted to ask David, so it's great to hear you come and talk to us. I first wanted to talk to you about a historical question. They've been fighting against the New Deal. They've been fighting against the Great Society. This has been going on since the 30s. And the question becomes, and I also think that if Watergate hadn't happened, Richard Nixon would have implemented some of these measures. So what's unique about this time as opposed to those past times?
I think that they have. I think there's two things. One is their imagination was fired by Trump, so there was a belief for a change that they could get things done that they had dreamed about for a long time, but that hadn't really been in reach. And I think the other thing is their willingness to pursue different methods. A lot of the ideas here are, things that they have been circulating for a long time. But there's, whereas Heritage, shied away from what they would have described as big government for a long time, I think this is a really big government plan. It's all about seizing as much power for the executive as possible, centralizing power, putting power in one branch. And, we saw the Bush administration obviously pursue some level of unitary executive, but not nearly on the level here. So I think it is that willingness to pursue big government and to put it in the service of this very Christian agenda. Those are the two things that set this apart from previous plans.
Now, I've looked at a lot of the interviews you did, and everybody wants to start off with the four goals of the Project 2025. And so what's different? I read many years ago the 1981 mandate for leadership that was published for Reagan, because I was curious to see what the Heritage Foundation had to say. And so what makes this unique? I mean, is it the time we're in? Is it the inflection point historically as our society? How do you see this?
I think they have realized that Trump presents an unusual moment. And it's, two ways. One, Trump is able to get things done that other presidents would not. So, for example, his willingness and ability to just bowl over Congress. We haven't seen any president with that kind of power to just cow them. So that allows him to put a lot of things in place that he wouldn't otherwise. You can imagine Congress pushing back on some of these things because they're taking over congressional prerogatives. But Congress doesn't want to pick a fight with Trump, or Republicans in Congress don't want to pick a fight with Trump. Um, the other thing, Trump is also unique in that he doesn't really care about that many things. He cares a lot about tariffs. He cares a lot about immigration. He cares a lot about retribution. But it creates this whole open area that somebody else can try to fill that vacuum. And they have filled that vacuum with their agenda. And so they have this symbiosis where they get the ability to pursue this this very Christian agenda and a lot of the things they care about. And they give him the muscle to do the few things that he cares about.
So how do you see Elon Musk in all this? I mean, because basically what he's doing is he's essentially gutting the federal government, which is in line with what they want. And in some ways, they're arguing about creating something akin to what Andrew Jackson did, the spoil system, except modern style. Everybody's in there who's a political appointee who's loyal to Trump, as Andrew Jackson wanted it back in the early 19th century. So what's going on with that?
Yeah, I think Musk is interesting. He's not contemplated in the original mandate for leadership document because at the time he was still outside the, not he's Trump friendly, but Trump curious, but not all the way in. I think they have managed to use him as a vessel, sort of like Trump. They have sort of directed him in the direct of where they want him to go and to destroy what they want to destroy, and he has done that. Not always exactly the same things. For example, he, Project 2025 proposes reworking U.S. aid but not abolishing it. Musk basically destroyed it to start off, and I think that's basically for political reasons more than anything. They're really explicit about that spoils question. I mean, they say we understand why the civil service was established in the 1880s. We understand that there were abuses, but this is just too bad. It's too much of a problem. It's too much of a problem to have people who will not report to the president. They're lazy. They never leave. They're not accountable. And so we need to return to a spoils system where, in fact, people are answerable to the president, so they'll actually do what he wants.
Well, let's deal with the issue of racism. Now, all throughout the document, DEI, I sort of say that DEI is essentially a new way to use the N-word, frankly, and except, politically correct, if you will. And this has been going on since the Nixon administration when they changed their attacks to affirmative action from, outright, early 1950s Ku Klux Klan type racism. And I'm just curious how you see that part of it because they're out to destroy the Great Society and the New Deal and in place put this vision of America in motion, which they seem to be working assiduously in a blitzkrieg type fashion doing. So how do you see the issue of race in all this?
They talk about DEI. They also talk about wokeness, which they never define. And I think it's a really effective political approach. They understand that there's a backlash against DEI and particularly against wokeness, especially if you don't say what that is. It's much easier to have a backlash against it that way. And they use it a little bit as the sort of tip of the spear to get into a lot of other things. So, the way they want to rework the entire apparatus of civil rights, I think, is remarkable. And it's not just kind of destroying it from the inside, but it's kind of subverting it. So rather than having the DOJ Civil Rights Division pursue and the voting rights section pursue, voter suppression, voter discrimination based on race, they want it to pursue bogus claims of voter fraud. Rather than have the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission pursue claims of sex or gender discrimination or racial discrimination, they wanted to pursue claims of anti-Christian discrimination. So they're switching the valence on all of these things. They want to use Title IX rather than to, for example, expand trans rights, but in fact to go after any universities that are trying to include trans athletes or really openness to LGBT people in general. There is then throughout, in addition to that sort of, destruction of the civil rights apparatus as we know it, there's also this kind of paternalistic attitude that I think they would say is colorblind, but they say, we need to eliminate a cultural dependency in certain communities, and we need to increase fatherhood in certain communities through the biblical basis of the family. A lot of those things are racially coded, but they're not explicitly mentioned as a matter of race in the text.
Huh. Well, that's interesting because you go back to the kind of arguments they made during the Nixon administration with Senator Moynihan, then advisor to domestic policy, the sort of family, Negro family, if you will. And the issue of the family Now, I see this as an interesting aspect of what they're doing because, and again, I mentioned before we started this, their attack on the far right of cultural Marxism, that's the sort of, emblematic. They're attacking, they blame Adorno, Horkheimer, uh, Marcuse for essentially destroying the nuclear family, permissivist homosexuality. And again, those ideas go back to the kind of issues that the National Socialist Party did in Germany as they were rising to power. But how do you see that family stuff, that family, the nuclear family? And again, divorce rates, the divorce statistics accelerated in the 1950s and have, basically been rather high. So, what is this, an Ozzie and Harriet fantasy they want? Or even something even crazier than that, going back to a 19th century painting or something?
They don't put a time specifically on it. But I think that gets at it. I mean, it's a kind of gauzy nostalgia without a particular era. But for them, I think for the people who are most closely involved with this, it's very religious. They are deeply Catholic or deeply Protestant Christian. They think that the Bible is the basis for American society, and they think it ought to be put back. They want to run so many social service programs through faith-based organizations. They want churches to do these things, to tutor people on fatherhood. And I think a lot of it is pushing back on this cultural Marxism. They see the Bible as the right basis for society and the right basis for life. They think that liberals are destroying those. And they think that you can fix that at the family unit. And we've obviously seen similar arguments from people like J.D. Vance with his focus on motherhood and on childless cat ladies. It's all coming from the same kind of taproot.
Now, how do you see the attacks? Journalism, of course, has been attacked from the get-go. We have the Stephanopoulos issue, the settlement. I know yesterday he went bananas on Trump in his TV show, talking about this is the most corrupt, crooked. How many billions of dollars are these guys taking when they go up on these trips in the Middle East? And then you have the issue of CBS attacking 60 Minutes. You have this issue of knocking out PBS, NPR, CPB, National Endowment of the Arts, National Endowment of Humanities. And then you have the attacks on the universities, which some argue is essentially attack on sources of objective knowledge. Now, we know the media has a very poor uh, opinion rate among the public and probably the universities too. But how do you see that? Is that like them just picking an easy target politically they can bounce around with?
I think I would take it on a couple levels. When you look at the attacks, for example, on CBS or on PBS and NPR, or on Comcast for that matter, it's this sense of we have all of these levers of government, all these levers of power that we haven't used. So they look at the FCC, for example, and say, wait a second, why are we not using this to knock NPR and PBS? We've been trying through Congress to defund PBS and NPR for decades. We haven't done it, but now we can do this through the FCC. There's this whole government approach. I think more broadly, there is an attack on any kind of independent institution. There's an interview where Russell Vogt says, we're trying to find the pockets of independence and stamp them out. And he meant that with reference to the executive branch. He specifically is, concerned about these independent regulatory agencies, FCC, FTC, you name it, that he thinks pose a threat to executive functioning and the Constitution. But more broadly, I think they want to go after any independent challenger. So that could be the independent regulatory agencies. That could be Congress, where they're seizing a lot of power from Congress. That can be universities. That can be science. That can be media institutions. All these things are a challenge to their power of the government, and they're also challenges to the cultural vision that they want to lay out.
Now, how do you see the conflict in the Middle East and the conflict in Ukraine, their foreign policy prescriptions? Because when I read their defense policy prescriptions, basically China's the main enemy. We have to rearm, and we see that in the budget that's being proposed, the Department of Defense budget goes way up. So how do you see, and then of course they're talking about strengthening America. We'll get to the immigration issue in a minute, but how do you see their foreign policy initiatives? And then of course we had this ridiculous issue of let's go invade Greenland, let's make Canada the 51st state, or let's go down in Panama. But I take them seriously at their word. They never know. They could have somebody in the Pentagon, oh, let's at the J5, let's plan an operation to go see these guys. So how do you see all that?
I think on the foreign policy section is more traditionally Republican than almost anything in here. And I think they have some differences with Trump on this. They, for example, are much more hawkish on Russia. They're more supportive of Ukraine. But it is almost entirely. I mean, what they share with Trump is they want to pull back from most of the world. They want the U.S. to be less engaged with almost all of the world and orient itself totally around China. and they see China in a very, I mean, a sort of McCarthyist who lost China sort of sense. It's very like we're in a cultural conflict with China, we're in an economic conflict with China. We may be in a military conflict, and we need to be prepared for this bilateral military conflict. We need to purge American institutions of anybody who is too soft on China and too friendly to China or doesn't recognize their danger. And we need to make our diplomatic and military focus countering China. So that's doing things to counter Belt and Road in Russia, in Africa, and other parts of Asia. It's consolidating alliances in Asia. It's a lot of things that Trump, I think, is fouling up. I mean, he's alienating Europe. He's alienating a lot of other potential allies. He's tariffing countries that they wouldn't tariff, and he's shattering those things. So that's a place where I see them a little bit in conflict with Trump.
Now, in the Project 25, there were different articles about the tariff and world economy issues. And supposedly, the arguments being made by some in the White House is that the tariff structure will allow us to reindustrialize the United States. And I'm wondering, and I don't know if that was really explicitly in the Project 2025, those kind of industrial policy type of issues. But that, of course, is something he's trying to sell to the public to make sure the midterms don't go awry for him. So how do you see that aspect of what's going on in real time in their policy interrelated to Project 2025?
I think that's another place where you can see some of these cleavages. So, the people involved in the Heritage Foundation and involved in this report are mostly products of the Reagan era, and they believe in free trade. And you can see they're willing to compromise on some things and not on others. So they're not willing to compromise on abortion. They're not willing to compromise on their vision of society. But they understand that Trump is the president, Trump is their vessel of power, and Trump cares, a great deal about tariffs. So they have these dueling chapters, one by a free trader arguing that tariffs are a bad idea, and then another by Peter Navarro, who of course is in the White House now, arguing in favor of tariffs. And Navarro, it is very much, we're going to reindustrialize. We want to, either onshore or nearshore things, move things into Latin America. We should tariff Chinese products at 100%. The goal should be to get rid of Chinese imports altogether. And he sees, China taking advantage of the U.S. in trade and wants to push back on that. It's much more narrowly focused than Trump's tariffs. Trump is so obsessed with trade deficits as a concept. And I think Navarro and others have tried to, sort of harness that and to support their agenda, but it's not the same. Trump just wants to tariff everyone, and he wants to take money from everyone in his vision, without really understanding how tariffs work.
Now, one of the things they talk about is when you do an industrial policy, education to the public has to be in a mass way, any sensible way of doing this, except, of course, they're out to destroy the Department of Education. They're in the middle of destroying it. And you have in the big, beautiful bill, I read the whole thing over the weekend. I said, oh my God.
You, unlike members of
Congress.
Congress.
As reading Project 2025. And I could see that, you have cuts in SNAP. You have cuts in Medicaid, which will come in automatically because of the increase in the debt. And you have cuts in Medicare. So how do you see all that? I mean, what kind of society are they aiming for when essentially they reduce all the social entitlements of the past 60 to 70, 80, 90 years to nothing?
They have been opposed to these things for a long time, as you said. There's an opposition to general New Deal programs and to Great Society programs. It's interesting, and it's also in conflict with Trump's promises, which have been, already broken in places. But his claims that he wouldn't touch Social Security or Medicare, and they say in Project 2025, they say our debt problem is a Social Security and Medicare problem. But then they don't want to touch that, and I think they understand the political toxicity, or they think it's politically toxic. But this is a place where they want a government that does much less for citizens, and they would like to shift that burden to churches and community organizations. Then they just think it should be the federal government's role. And in education, they would like to be, their ideal situation would be for America to get out of the public school business altogether. And have the government funding schools, but basically providing national vouchers so that states could run, public religious schools or religious schools. They could run private schools of all sorts, but they wouldn't have to maintain public schools as we know them.
Now, tell us who these architects are. And again, I sort of look at this from a longue durée point of view historically. They've been arguing these things in different ways, going back again to the New Deal. I mean, you could bring up John C. Calhoun, who's from the state further south of you in South Carolina, the whole issue of using states' rights as a bogus defense for slavery. But Explain who Kevin Roberts is, Paul Dans, and Russell Voigt, and any other individuals that jump out at you as representing these ideas. Where are they coming from intellectually? How'd they get to this point?
Yeah, they come from different places, but they sort of come together in this strain. So Roberts is the head of the Heritage Foundation, and he's been in conservative circles for a long time, and he took over Heritage at the end of or toward just after the first Trump administration, and Heritage had been sort of on a rough patch. They'd hired Jim DeMint, the Tea Party South Carolina senator, successor to John C. Calhoun. And his tenure had been rocky. Then they replaced him with Kay Cole James, but she clashed with the Trump administration. And so Kevin Roberts came in with a desire to sort of bring heritage back. And he's friends with people like J.D. Vance, who famously or infamously wrote the foreword to his book. He wanted to put together a platform for the next conservative president to kind of avoid the problems they had seen with Trump's first administration. And for that, he called a guy named Paul Dans. And Dans is an interesting figure. He calls himself from full deplorable stock, by which he means a scion of a Kennedy Democratic family who saw the error of Democrats' ways. So his parents had met in Washington. He grew up in the D.C. area. Went to urban planning school and then to law school, and in law school became a member of the Federalist Society, but didn't go into politics, partly because he thought the political scene was just too unfriendly to conservatives. Worked in law in New York City for a long time, and was a Trump supporter, starting in 2011 because of birtherism. And he believed when Trump was elected in 2016, it was going to be his ticket to a plum job in the Justice Department. But it wasn't. He didn't manage to get into the administration until 2018. He didn't make it to the White House until 2020. And he blamed that on political appointees who he thought were rhinos or Bush conservatives or saboteurs who were standing in his way. And so you see that very much in the way he approached this, which is we have to get political appointees who are going to be on the team, who really care about these things, who are not Bush people, and we have to train them and we have to have them ready, which is leads right to Project 2025's database of potential political appointees. The intellectual architect, I'd say, is Russell Vogt. And Vogt is, he worked for Phil Gramm for years, the great deregulator from Texas, worked for Jeb Hensarling, worked at Heritage. Went to Wheaton College, very religious, and he has this affect of wonk. He reads and scans as being very quiet and nerdy, but he says these really inflammatory things. Maybe most famously saying, we want to put the bureaucrats in trauma. And he was in OMB in Trump's first term and eventually led it. In between, he worked on this. He also led Trump's platform committee for the Republican National Convention, and now he's back at OMB. And he is, I'd say, sort of the inside man, the one who's thought a lot about how government functions, and so how they can take over the executive branch, how they can use OMB and other offices to push their agenda in and to get the things done that they want to do. I think he's been instrumental in sort of shaping how Musk has approached Doge, and also doing a lot of pushing a lot of these executive orders and other ideas through the executive branch just in these first few months.
Yeah, you could see how they were prepared with all these executive orders. They actually talked about that in Project 2025. And they were well prepared. And of course, they're going after abortion, they're going after climate change. I mean, the whole nine yards, everything. And one of the things I remember from the aftermath of the 2020 election was I remember going to events in the academy, at Yale, at Columbia, NYU, and people were talking about authoritarianism. And I remember going in and seeing Jason Stanley for the first time raising the F word, the fascism word. And how do you stand on that issue? Because some of them are saying, oh, they're basically copying Viktor Orban's. Part of the reason why they want to knock out a big target like Harvard is similar to what he did with the Soros operation in Budapest when they forced him to move to Vienna. But again, is this fascism? What is it? How do you see this from based on your work here?
I mean, I think it's certainly an attempt to move towards an authoritarian system. They want to centralize power with a single figure. They want to neutralize these sources of dissent and opposition. They want to neutralize Congress. I think they're clearly taking inspiration from people like Orban. It's been fascinating, I think, over the last few years to see the way conservative figures have embraced him, hosted him, talked about him a lot, and held up Hungary as a model for the U.S., which is a strange situation. You know, I don't know. I would say I think Trump's impulses certainly run much more towards the F word. I think the folks here are not necessarily not ideological in that sense. They're very concerned with religion. I think they're more theocrats than anything else. But they're also they're very technical about it. So rather than being driven by any particular label, they're just looking for ways to grab the power they can and to exercise it and to bring about the society they want.
Yeah. Yeah, it's sort of funny. I remember years ago arguing with somebody at a Pacifica station about covering the rise of fundamentalist religion in our society. And he said, "Oh, no, you can't do that. I was raised in an Anglican environment." I said, "Well, look, how many people have converted to Marxism and Leninism in the United States in the past 30 years as opposed to become fundamentalist Christians? I mean, we have to pay attention to this." Now, people who want to ask questions to David, please raise your hands. You know how to do that in the little buttons down there. And while we're doing that, let me just ask some more questions. So the Supreme Court issue, the issue, they're basically in the middle of having all these legal battles. And it's obvious that he's counting on the Supreme Court to bail him out. Certainly after U.S. versus Trump basically said he can do whatever the hell he wants. He can go on Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and he'll get excused for that. So how do you see, and the DOJ, of course, is now being weaponized as essentially a legal firm for him. Plus, he's got all these legal firms basically bending down to, give him, hundreds of millions of dollars of free legal advice. So give us a sense of that. And it's clear to me that the emphasis on Article 2 of the Constitution, that is the executive branch, is a clear violation of Article 1, or, all the whole 9 yards. But he doesn't give a damn. How do you see all that coming out in the process we're looking at right now?
Well, I'd say first the DOJ stuff is a very explicit goal here. They look at DOJ and they say it doesn't make any sense to have a department that has a head appointed by the president who serves at the pleasure of the president, and then the president can't tell them what to do. Of course he can, and so we've seen Trump doing that in directing investigations of political enemies, firing line prosecutors, blowing through every guardrail at DOJ and treating it really as his personal law firm, and then I think is the arm of a lot of his retribution. The judiciary is a somewhat more complicated case where there is in Project 2020. I think Project 2025 doesn't think very completely about the judiciary. There's this almost religious faith that the Supreme Court will be on their side. So they look at things like for example, see the Impoundment Control Act, which they want to use to seize the power of the purse.
Explain that to people what that is.
Yeah. So the Impoundment Control Act is a 1974 law which, presidents for a long time would impound funds. So basically refuse to spend funds that Congress had appropriated. And Congress finally had enough of this with Nixon and passed a law saying funds could only be impounded with a specific request under specific circumstances. Russ Vought believes that the Impoundment Control Act is unconstitutional. And if they can just get the right test case to the Supreme Court will agree and rule it unconstitutional. They also believe that the independent regulatory agencies are unconstitutional. The Supreme Court said in 1935 that they were not, but they think they can get the Supreme Court to reconsider that. And in fact, the Supreme Court issued a preliminary opinion just a few days ago that seemed to validate that. So they may be right. But what happens when they come in conflict with the courts is a great question. They don't really talk about the district or circuit courts. They only talk about the Supreme Court briefly and with this faith. So, we've seen it's a mixed record. U.S. v. Trump was a pretty serious blow. We've seen in other places they're willing to stand up to him a little bit or on particular issues. And I don't think they have thought about what they're going to do in that situation. Obviously, Trump's impulse is to rage and who knows, what he might threaten. But I don't think they have a plan for how to go around that. Whereas in other places, they do have contingency plans.
Yeah, it was interesting back in last year when they sort of retreated from Project 2025 because the polling showed that he would get basically clobbered. And, it was a very calculated decision, clever decision on the part of Trump to distance himself from that. But anyway, go on, Kay. Please jump in.
Well, I came off of a YouTube video which was comparing objectively the G7 and BRICS, which is something we don't hear much about in America. The media is not talking about it. BRICS is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And now it's actually BRICS Plus. It includes the UAE and Indonesia and who knows what else. Basically, there is almost no comparison economically. They have way over 50% of the world population. They have almost all of the manufacturing that the entire world depends on. Um, so if and the G7, is going downhill. So I'm there, I'm not an economist, but this raises concerns for is this like a last ditch attempt to restore power to the G7, to the West, to white people? And if it's so inevitable or it looks, I don't think they're going to succeed in isolating China as a target in this context. So if they're not succeeding, does that bode better for us or worse for us? That's my question.
That's a good question. I mean, I don't think they're doing a good job of pushing towards the kind of isolation that they talk about. And I think they're the way they treat most of the world is very superficial. Um, you hear them talking about Africa in broad terms. You hear them talking about Latin America in pretty broad terms. We know, for example, that Trump had was a fan of Jair Bolsonaro, but he doesn't. It's not clear, what his policy is in a meaningful sense beyond that kind of personal relationship with Brazil, especially now that Lula's back in power. He likes Modi in India, but it's not clear what his India policy is, although he obviously, like a lot of American presidents, sees India as a potential counterweight to China. I think it's just, if they're looking to maintain American power, I think they're doing it in an ineffective way. Because so many of these things are on, the tariffs in general, and economic stewardship overall are undermining faith in the U.S. And the dollar as reserve currency. They're not doing a good job of keeping together alliances. I'm not sure how they see it, but I don't think it really adds up. And I think that is partly tied to the fact that for them the world is an afterthought, and they're very much, their biggest focus is on American domestic policy and on domestic society.
Yeah, that seems to be one of the big weaknesses, the issue of the integration that's been going on economically, hell, for centuries into the world. It's some of it's, I mean, in Europe, right now, uh, close friends of mine who are in Europe visiting, that's all they ask is about what's going on here. They're sort of like in a state of shock. Go on, Dimitri.
First, I have a small remark about BRICS. Don't forget
Brexit, oh,
that
Brexit, yeah.
Russia is white as lily. There is no, it's so idea about non-white population as Russia is bogus. The second is I emphasize that role of the family was important for communism, for any government which want a strong country. And it was very strong in the communist Russia, where I used to live for a while. It has nothing to do with the religion, nothing to do. It's simply the foundation of the country as most people see it. It's not religion at all. So, and the use of fascism, it's kind of bizarre use. You can use word authoritarian. That will be more properly used because fascism has very bad associations and it's become a slur practically. And it definitely doesn't fit the Project 25 and its intentions. Making government strong and reshaping our institution, it has nothing to do with fascism. It's simply different subject.
But I think in terms of the family, it is true that there are lots of systems and lots of societies that have pushed the family. In this case, I think they would argue that their conception of the family, and they do argue that their conception of the family is specifically religious. That they want it to be based in biblical notions of family, in biblical notions of fatherhood. They want it to be based in the church. So I don't think it's that the focus on the family is inherently religious. I think it's the way that they come to that focus and the way they want to enact it is in fact religious, though.
You can say that, but the results are the same. You know, you can say that family, you can make your marriage in a church or in a civil institution, but it's not critical. The critical is existence of a family, as everybody knows that broken families, single mothers, are the most vulnerable portion of society, which produce poverty and cannot manage their children in very many situations.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a sort of diagnosis that I think Barack Obama would share with the Project 2025 people. That's where I think they're not, they have a prescription that is very much based in religion, but the diagnosis is not that far off from it's not it isn't far it is the same as I would say mainstream American society and even most Democrats.
Yeah, I would argue that the family issue is we look at our culture. Look at our culture. Look at the movies we watch. Look at the TV series we watch. Even the apocalyptic ones, it's the family that's the most important thing that people are loyal to in the midst of zombie attacks, etc. And I think that going back to the debates about this, I've worked with single mothers in situations in New York where I had tutored their kids. And, we're talking about if you take away Medicaid, you take away SNAP, you take away the Pell Grants, you sort of take those kind of things away that actually allow them to move if they're hardworking, then what do you do? What are you doing? You're basically reinforcing a static social structure that has become more unequal economically in the past 60 to 70 years in America. And so that's where perhaps, but I understand what you're saying, Dimitri. Thank you. Um, Anybody else have comments they want to talk about because I could go on and on. Don't worry about it. All right. Now, let's talk about yes, go on, Tristan, please. You just have to unmute, Tristan. Yes.
Hi, David. I was hearing a little while ago, or reading some comments from Donald Trump about trying to circumvent the two term limit for the presidency. Is there any real sort of merit to the argument that he could do that? And if he was able to do that, what would be the sort of broader implications of that action on American political society if he was able to try to be elected again, and if he was able to run again?
Is there any merit? I mean, no, and yet I can't rule it out. There have been many things that struck me as not having a lot of legal merit that Trump has done or attempted and sometimes succeeded. So I don't know how seriously to take it. When you listen to the arguments the specifics of their arguments, I mean, it's like, Trump says that you can only be elected twice, but he could do sort of a Putin Medvedev thing where he could run as vice president and then his presidential running mate would step down. He would become the president, and that would allow him to serve a third term. You have a very hard time finding a legal scholar who thinks that passes muster. You had a lot of legal scholars who didn't think that Trump would succeed in his immunity case too. I think it's a dangerous situation if he finds a workaround to what is very clearly the language of the Constitution and the intent of the Constitution. Trump is very adept at finding weak places in the system, pushing on them, and looking for ways to expand his power that way. I don't think that if he found he could mow through that amendment, he would stop there. And I think we'd be in a dangerous situation where the plain language of the Constitution hadn't held. I think maybe the biggest reason to be optimistic about that is when Trump is in power, people tend to not like him. He won on the electoral vote in 2016, obviously, but not a popular vote. His party suffered in 18 and in 20 and in 22. In 24, backlash to Joe Biden seems to have been a major, and to the Democrats in general, seems to have been a major factor. And now that Trump is back in office, people are upset about his handling of many things and his popularity is down. So, I don't know that he would be able to win a third term under current conditions or similar ones. So it might be a moot point. But I think it's a dangerous idea, and I don't think it holds legal water.
Hmm. Interesting, because you have, of course, the spectacle we saw from 2023 to 2024 of, all these legal cases basically fall by the wayside. And then, of course, he perpetuates this notion that the 2020 election was stolen from him. And, his whole disregard for the Constitution in what led to January 6th. I sometimes wonder whether we're going to see some shenanigans with the midterms, to be honest with you. But anyway, and as a journalist, how do you see that? The way he, because he's always doing reality shows. Every day is a TV show for him. He when he did that little number with Zelensky, when he did that number with Cyril Ramaphosa, he loves to do. He said, and Zelensky basically said, "Oh, it's going to be good television." So everybody knows he was the typical. I don't know if you're a New Yorker, David, but he's very much a typical New Yorker of a certain type, as far as I'm concerned. A big BS artist. But how do you see all that swirling around with this Project 2025 stuff?
I mean, I would say, first of all, in terms of the attention thing, it's a real challenge as a journalist because you feel like, on the one hand, when he says outrageous things like "I'm going to run for a third term," you have to pay that attention, but also that seems to fit the goal um, of distracting from things. I think they're very content to have Trump as the front man and to be taking up a lot of attention. They understand many of the things that they're pursuing here are not popular. They have the polling data. But a debate about, well, for example, a debate about the courts and whether they're overwhelming, they're overruling popular will, for example, or a debate about immigration. Those are much more amenable territory than a lot of the things in Project 2025. So they're just as happy for Trump to pick those fights publicly while they work more quietly behind the scenes of the executive branch, moving through the policies they want to see.
Please raise your hands. Now, the immigration issue. Again, that's an issue that we've seen historically evolve in the United States. The Irish were attacked before the Civil War. You had the Italians attacked. The Italians were hung in New Orleans and treated as black people in these riots against Italians from southern Italy. And of course, Jews coming in and et cetera, all this stuff against immigration. So and we got to the point where you come down the stairs in 2015 and was able to get away with, like, all these people are rapists. I've worked in situations with undocumented people, and these are all hardworking people who just want to come to the United States and better their lives like everyone else did historically. And so that evil other, the demonization of the evil other, how does that fit into all this with Project 2025?
I think what's interesting about immigration in Project 2025 is less what they say about undocumented immigrants and what they say about legal immigrants. Because the language about undocumented immigrants, the desire to militarize the border, to close the border, to deploy the military necessary, to shut things down, mass deportation, major detention centers. Those are things we've heard from Trump elsewhere. And what they're pushing, which is very similar to an agenda that Stephen Miller has pushed, is reducing legal immigration as well. So, they want to reduce the number of visas that are available. They want to reduce the kinds of visas that are available. They want to stop pushing visas through the State Department, among other things. They want to look at revoking visas, as we've seen with student visas, among other things. They want to reinvestigate people's citizenship applications to see if they falsified anything and can be denaturalized. So I think that the goal is really to wall off the country as much as possible and to maintain the sort of demographic mix as it is now.
So, what's the pushback on all this? Because, I listened to you talk to Miller, and Miller raised a good point. I've been arguing this Republicans have to go through a Tea Party phenomenon. I've been arguing this for many years, by the way. And I'm not holding my breath. But, and actually the approval ratings, it's a mixed bag there because Trump, actually did a little better last week. So the issue of the midterms is something that I think the Democrats are going to have a problem with because theoretically, particularly if a recession is induced, they can just go after him big time. But he's not stupid. He's going to try to manipulate the situation. And I just noticed last week they had a legal decision which theoretically could allow him to fire the head of the Federal Reserve and basically clear the decks of these appointees. So, how do you see that part going through? What's the response? How do you see the response to all this? And the response to your book, by the way,
I
how's
mean,
it going?
Democrats seem so busy still litigating the 2024 election that they can't catch up. One of the things, I hope my book would provide a service of letting people sort of understand where things were going. It amazes me that Democrats who have had since 2023, summer 2023, to read this still seem surprised by each of these moves and do not seem to have
Yeah.
a plan for them. I understand if ordinary citizens don't, but I'm not sure what the Democrats are doing. Um, it seems to me that they are. You're right. Trump's approval is up a little bit, and the economic view is a little bit dark. We would assume in a normal midterm election year, which this may or may not be, that Democrats will do well at least in the House. And there's almost a little bit of a danger there where they can do well in the House without having to really put together much of a platform or have a vision or be prepared for anything simply by virtue of the pendulum swinging back. Um, but they don't seem to have much of a plan. I keep people keep asking me where the Democratic Project 2029 is. If anybody is working on that, I have not heard about it, and no one has told me about it. I'm still waiting for those sources to call me. So it's I think it is remarkable how far they are behind. I think there's two things that feel really important. Like one is from a Democratic standpoint, I think the lesson to learn from this is the value of thinking not only about what they want to do, but how they want to do it, and of planning those methods ahead of time and bringing together a wide coalition on something. There are hundreds of group or dozens of groups involved in this report, 70 some authors or contributors. So they did manage to sort of co-opt a lot of people and bring them into a single agenda. That's a little bit harder to do on the Democratic side because the coalition is so broad, but that would be helpful. I think from a nonpartisan point of view, what I have been thinking about is just the importance of fixing Congress. So many of these things are about the dysfunction of Congress. The authors of Project 2025 write about how Congress is broken. They don't want to do anything. They can't pass legislation. They can't pass a budget. They pass off the ability to declare war in effect to the president. There's lots of other places where they don't want to take political hits, so they pass that to the president. And then Project 2025's answer to that is to seize even more power from Congress. But if you are concerned about these things and you're concerned about authoritarianism, what you need is a good counterweight, and that should be Congress. There's a lot of structural challenges there. The way Congress holds elections, the fact that there are something like a dozen competitive districts remaining at this point because so many of them are so gerrymandered and safe. So I think Congress is the root of a lot of these problems, and if you could figure out how to solve that, you'd have the country on a much safer track.
Right. I actually lobbied in Congress several times in my life, so I know how hard it is to go through Congress. Michael, you've been wanting to jump in. Michael, you just have to unmute. Mike, can you unmute, Michael? All right. Well, he will unmute and I will allow him to interrupt me. Well, again, that's a real problem because the vision issue is a very interesting thing. And, we sort of see Bernie running around with this oligarchy thing with AOC. She's my congressperson. And it's interesting in her district, a lot of people voted for Trump. And I was having these long discussions, like a month after it happened, they began to discover they'd made a mistake. So people would stop me on the street and say, hey Jim, I I feel bad, and I didn't want to lay. I mean, I have a lot of F words too, but anyway, I was trying to be empathetic about it. But because one guy said I voted for him because he promised not to tax overtime, and I said, well, did that happen already? I don't think so, man. Uh, and so the question of the working class is interesting to me because I am old enough to remember how Wallace was so attractive to people. David Carter's book, Politics of Rage, brilliant book, which, as far as I'm concerned, that's one stream going into this. And of course, Archie Bunker, was a big phenomena when I was actually doing union organizing in 1972, and so I'd come in and get compared to the meathead all the time. But again, the issue of losing the working class, losing the lower middle class, the white working class, um, and this whole male issue, which I find interesting too, because they bring up, Joe Rogan got like 70 million plus people watching that bullshit interview he did with him. And, um, so those culture issues, how do you think about all that? Because you're in the South, you're in
Hmm.
North Carolina, and North Carolina, I could say was a purple state, to be fair,
Yeah, it's a reddish
based
purple.
around
Yeah,
Duke.
yeah.
Yeah. So how do you see all that coming out? Because and again, I have friends who voted for Trump. I love them. They know what I think about Trump. I still love them, but what are you going to do?
I mean, I think what we've seen from Trump consistently is he's really good at speaking to those sorts of frustrations. And there's the people talk about this ad nauseum, but the sort of authenticity. Like he hates the same people you hate. He's mad at the same people. He feels authentically mad. He feels even if he's not telling the truth, he feels like he's authentically expressing himself. The problem is how you deliver on that. And that didn't go well for him in the first term. He got people who switching back because they were upset about the failure to deliver. I think a lot of the things he's talking about in Project 2025 are similar. I mean, they want to allow men to be the breadwinner and be able to do that with a single income. They want to make fathers more important. They want to make manufacturing really important. These things speak to those concerns again. I don't think they're going to be able to deliver.
Right.
I'm curious to see where that goes. If you look at tariffs, for example, the tariffs in Trump's first term didn't really deliver the relief for the Midwest that it was intended. But in places most affected by the tariffs, Trump did better in 2020 than he did in 2016. So there's still a sort of affective response to that. There's also, I mean, specifically on Project 2025, there's some Democratic polling in fall of 2024 where they asked people about policies in here, and they said, well, I hate that policy, and I don't think Trump is going to do it. So there's a sort of credibility gap between they see him, they don't think he's going to do these things, which is sometimes reasonable. But if he does and they don't go well, I'm curious to see where people go on that.
Well, he's very
You got to
clever.
deliver.
He's very clever about the Social Security issue, which we know is screwed. I mean, I'm on Social Security, so I also see it happening right now in front of my face. And the issue of Medicare with this, I'm wondering how you explain that because supposedly the debt limits kick in mandatory budgetary cuts. Is that's where they get this number of 500 billion that will be cut by Medicare? Are you familiar with all that?
I still don't totally understand all of
Okay,
the
me
workings, to
too.
be honest.
Okay, me too. Go
We'll
on,
see
Bruce.
what the Senate does with it.
Yeah, right. Go on. Yeah, right. Exactly. That's going to be interesting to watch. Go on, Bruce.
Um, yeah, I mean, I'm just wondering. They have this theology, which is nice. It's kind of like a coat of paint on the car, but they don't talk about the motor or the transmission or the tires. So what I'm trying to say by that is it's really great these theories about the family and the church is going to step in for SNAP, EBT, and you know the kind of Section 8 housing. Do they really seriously think that the churches are going to be able to carry that load, or the churches are going to step in for the next hurricane season? I mean, did the churches step in for the hurricanes in North Carolina that FEMA still hasn't addressed, and they just cut FEMA by 40%? I mean, when does reality set in? Because you can complain about um, the government is overstaffed and waste and fraud and all that crap. But right now, the NAOA doesn't have enough people to predict, the tornadoes and the hurricanes. And there was a couple of stories about how people had to work triple shifts just because they felt loyalty. I mean, me, I would have walked out. Fine, you fired half of the people. Fuck it, do it yourself. But at what point are they gonna come down to earth and say, yeah, are the churches really going to be able to carry this load? The latest thing is now they want to get rid of a whole bunch of national parks, and they want to give them to the states, including one of the largest ones in Florida. And the states are going, no, we don't want them. We're not taking them. And then you've got the public schools, so it's like fine, so every public school gets a Bible, but we don't give enough money, to repaint the walls and all the rest of it. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. And in terms of reshoring manufacturing, I was involved with the CPA and some manufacturing initiatives. It's not enough to just say, oh, we're going to put tariffs on and the jobs are coming back or the manufacturing is coming back. It takes 5 or 6 years to set up a factory. And you have to have the infrastructure. So right now, one of the things people don't realize is, we don't make screws or bolts or nuts in America anymore. There's only 2 companies left that make fasteners or screws. All that is made overseas. So if you're building anything, you need screws. If you're we import all of our precision CNC machining equipment from Europe. We don't have any. Like after the Second World War, we were the king of, lathes and grinders and all that kind of stuff. We don't have any of that anymore. You cannot just slap a tariff out and then the manufacturing facility is going to spring into action. But so at what point are they going to, okay, so that's my question. At what point are they going to realize that, I mean, this is a wonderful fairy story. I have 3 kids. None of them have a family. The young people are not getting married and they're not having kids. I mean, the reality is the family formation level is in the toilet. So that's my first question. At what point is reality going to set in? They're going to go like, oh, well, maybe this is not going to work.
I mean, they'd agree about family formation, and they see that as a real problem. But I think that when you don't provide services, you disincentivize people doing that.
Yeah, but young people are looking at wait. So they haven't fixed the income problem.
Right.
Young people's income hasn't grown in the last 15 years, maybe 3%. So how am I going to afford a single breadwinner to raise a family, especially in New York, where
Right.
the minimum for a family of 4 or 2 is like 140,000 a year? So I'm making 30. So
Yeah. There's a sort of
I'm
magical step where they want to create families and they want single male breadwinner, individual male breadwinners, and they want to bring factories back, but they don't. They sort of wave their hands over those crucial steps. I think Trump's short attention span is a problem there too. You're talking about a 5 to 6 year time frame. They can't. Yeah, but they have an idea, but they
the
can't.
problem. I mean, it's wonderful to have this
Yeah.
fantasy that we're going to go back to the 50s, with Ozzie and Harriet and all that kind of stuff. When you could, my father raised a family as a single breadwinner, but not now. It ain't happening. The other,
Right. And they're not, they're not maybe as antagonistic to unions, for example, but the way to build prosperity in the middle class is labor unions, and they don't want to do that. So they're taking out the ways to achieve those things.
well, that's what I'm saying. They're fantasizing. I mean,
Yep.
there's no wheels on the car. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's true. I
Yeah,
mean,
no. I think that when you talk about the social services, for example, it ultimately comes down to ideology. They would like private organizations, religious organizations to fill the gap, but if they don't, their attitude is, well, it's not our problem. The federal government shouldn't be in this business. Same for FEMA. Federal government shouldn't be in this business, or should be in this business to a limited degree. And so if it doesn't work out, it's just not their problem. It's just not their problem. They don't care.
tough shit.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, well, that's a good point you raised because it gets to the issue of the abortion issue. Because they want everybody, they're anti-abortion. Then, of course, when the kid is born, they don't give a damn. Anyway, Michael, you wanted to say something, Mike? You want to unmute? Michael?
Let me just ask my second question.
All right, go on, Bruce.
So my own personal feeling is the people who are supporting the Heritage Foundation, which are Chase Manhattan Bank, Dow Chemical, General Motors, Mobil, Pfizer, the usual crowd, they want their tax cuts.
Right.
And the Heritage Foundation can sell you a line of fairy stories and talk about religion and Christianity and this and that. They don't care what you say, as long as they get their tax cuts. And more importantly than the corporate rate are all the carve outs and loopholes and the rest of it. So how true is it, do you think, that the real game here is the corporations that are funding the Heritage Foundation are getting what they want, and they don't give a rat's ass about any of the theology or whether Jesus could walk on water and all that kind of stuff.
I mean, I think it's certainly true that the corporate sponsors are not here for the religion, and they are there for. I mean, it's deregulation across the board. It's deregulation of environmental companies. It's deregulation of oil and gas. It's slashing of income taxes. They want a flat tax, basically, which is extremely regressive.
Yeah,
Consumption tax. So I think all of that stuff adds up.
I,
But
li- I live on Long Island, and Lee Zeldin is the Suffolk Republican absolute disaster for Suffolk, Long Island on the environment. You got a 14 from the environmental, I don't want the League of Women Voters or some environment. So they put him in charge of EPA.
Yeah.
Like,
They also want to
brilliant.
abolish the Fed, which I don't think those companies want, but they just trust that that isn't going to happen. So they feel like they can kind of go along with it, I think, in the short term on the assumption that
They
would fail.
figured out the bond market is going to go overseas. There'll be an
They
exit for the door.
I mean, they must know, but they continue
You know
to
that
argue this.
Germany is asking for the tons of gold that they have here back. They want to repatriate it.
I
Yeah,
hadn't seen that.
and Bruce, that's a very good point because that to me is one of their big flaws. The way they're screwing up the global political economy is contrary to their interests. Michael, if you can unmute. All right, go on, Dimitri. We're going to just start winding up. Dimitri, go on.
I think that talking about screws and bolts is a little bit simplistic, as we lost all the big industries like shipbuilding. It's much bigger than screws and bolts, and this is unacceptable. So there are no ships actually can built in the United States. With the all of them are in China or South Korea. And this, nobody expect that it will be created in a year or two. Yes, it will take 5, 6 years. So it's not surprise to anybody. And these people who wrote this uh, 20 project 25, they are not that naive and expect that it will happen overnight. So give them a break.
I think the question is not whether they are well. Some of them I think are fairly naive, but others are not. But they have to contend with whether Trump is an effective way to get those things done. And on some of them he is, and on others I'm not convinced he is. Partly because their approach is, well, we want to tariff China so that you can move manufacturing to more friendly nations, or you can onshore it. But if you are tariffing everybody, it's much harder to build those relationships or to convince people to move back. And if you're changing the tariffs every week, it's even harder for anyone to plan. And that's what the problem is. It's not that they're naive; it's that they are contending with a president who is not with the program on them.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Dimitri. Michael, you have the last word here. Michael, dear Michael. All right. Michael, you have to unmute, baby. All right. Well, my final comments about this is I got an email from somebody who is very concerned about the National Park Service and this whole 1776 project. And when I was preparing and thinking about your book, I was thinking about how after the war, after World War II, the liberal consensus, if you will, was dominant. And even someone like Eisenhower was not going to mess with the New Deal. And in terms of social entitlement and spending and things like that. And that, of course, leads to the question of our concept of ourselves historically. We're going through a 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, and we're having situations happen where they would take down websites about Jackie Robinson. They take down websites about the Underground Railroad. They're actually having a rally in the Gettysburg National Park about these kind of issues. And that's a question I just want to pose to you, David, as an idea, like how, the issue, I could quote Orwell, of course, you control history, you control everything. But how do you see, and I know it's not mentioned in Project 2025, but that kind of, what kind of quote narrative, mass socialization you're going to put forth to the public? Where do you see that going? Because we're already decades away from accepting sort of a ridiculous notion of American history, one where slavery doesn't exist. The whole issue of CRT, which is nonsense. As being someone who actually read CRT stuff back in the early 80s, I remember it was like, okay, that's cool. It's critical legal theory. Now it's CRT. What the hell? It's interesting intellectually, but I didn't really take the advantage of it. And then, of course, they made it a dirty word. So I'm just wondering your reflection on that as a journalist, because journalists, of course, are the first item of history, as we know. Um, how do you see that, the way the issue of thought and everything? And yeah, they took down the Enola Gay website. Very interesting. What an idiotic thing to do. Go on.
Yeah, I mean, so much of this is, I think it's the same as, attacking these independent centers of knowledge and these independent theories. They look at so many of these things. They look at DEI, and they look at critical studies of American history as undermining the national project and as being part of this cultural Marxism, and as being a threat to the country as they wish it to be. And so they want to push that out. I think this is where you see them on the one hand proposing, they want to cut a lot of pieces of government, but they also want a very overweening government that's going to control the curriculum.
Right,
It's
right.
going to control what you can learn. And people ask sort of, well, why should I be concerned about this? This sounds like a lot of policy. It's very abstract. Like, this is like what happens in your bedroom, and it's what happens in your children's classroom, and it happens in a classroom where you teach, wherever it is. These things I think are very direct, and they do very much want to shape the narrative, and they want to close down media organizations that might challenge it. So it has been remarkable, I think, over the last few years to see how contested American history has been. I think that will only ramp up with the 250th anniversary here, and they've made clear where they stand and what side they're on.
Yeah, exactly. And I remember covering the National History Standards fight many years ago, decades ago, which was the same kind of nonsense. I mean, again, there was an arrogance in academia, actually, which is justified to criticize. But nevertheless, their attitude was, well, this is the latest scholarship, so hence all the people should accept that. And that, of course, doesn't fly in the face of things, particularly in all the gay controversy. But Michael, can you finally unmute Michael? Michael. Ah, there you
Yeah,
go.
can you hear me?
I got you. Fine.
God almighty, I'm sorry, I'm having incredible Wi-Fi problems. I'm
Well, I
standing
always
outside
blame
the
it on
street.
Trump when that happens, man. Go on.
It is Trump's fault. We
Yeah,
all
it's
know
his
that.
fault. Go on.
My question is because you talked about the idea of we just discussed the idea of being, in other words, removing abortion, therefore forcing people to have kids, but as Jim said, not giving a shit about them afterwards. Same thing with tariffs, not considering the long-term consequences of losing markets, of losing business. So my question becomes, what happens then is if you have more children done to more lower class families and more minority families, then those children eventually will turn out to be on the opposite side of the Republicans, of the MAGA movement politically. And it may force a situation where, in order to retain power, now, of course, people like Trump don't care after 4 years anyway, but in order for them to maintain power, they would have to get rid, effectively, of the United States, of the Constitution. It would have to become an authoritarian or totalitarian government because the vast majority of the people then would be against the government that put them in that situation. Isn't that the ultimate, if not goal, isn't that the ultimate result?
And let me just add to that the question of the Alien and Enemies Act, which they have been rebuffed at the lower courts, but is going up to the Supreme Court. And then you have the issue of the Insurrection Act. You have all these different acts that will give tremendous power to the president. He was actually urged by Miller to bring in the army, bring in the military back during the George Floyd riot. So just to conclude on that issue, and again, the F word, fascism word, other versions of the F word will leave out of this discussion. Um, you know, that is something that is not a sort of fantasy kind of threat that they make. They've actually said that. So just as to conclude on this, what are your thoughts about all that?
So I'd say, first of all, I think they understand that a lot of these things are not popular. They did polling. Heritage did polling last summer, which found 14% approval for heritage or for Project 2025 in battleground states, and with high awareness. They understand that these things are unpopular, and so they wanted to move quickly. They said, the first 100 days, really before anybody can stop, is really essential. The first 2 years, these are really essential periods to get as much as they can done because they know the pendulum of politics will swing and they need to be prepared for it. So in that sense, I think what they want to do is change the baseline. This is their opportunity to, move the baseline much further to the right than it has been. And to sort of shift the national consensus a little bit, and then they'll be working from a better place next time they have power. But they are also consolidating so much power in the White House, in the executive branch, and in particular, whether by design or not, the person who they're consolidating that with is somebody who has shown a willingness to, or a desire to call out the military, to shoot at protesters, to disobey courts and disobey the Constitution. So if you put that power in the hands of a Trump, you can imagine some draconian solutions coming out of it.
Yes. Well, and do you have a copy of the book you could wave in front of you here?
I do.
Oh, great. So here is this book that you all must go buy, The Project. And I guess you could get it on Amazon in your local bookstore. It's a great short synopsis of this amazing, because remember, some of you participated in those study groups we did last fall on Project 29 and 2025, excuse me, 29. I'm going ahead a few years. And it was quite an amazing thing to read out loud. We read the damn thing out loud, David, with a whole bunch of people, and it was
impressive.
it was like, whoa, what the hell is this? And I was laughing when I was listening to you respond to other people saying, like, you go talk to your wife about what the hell did they just argue about? But anyway, this episode of Noisy Realities with David Graham, who is a staff writer at the Atlantic magazine. He's also a professor at Duke University in the journalism school. He teaches long-form journalism. Is that correct?
Yeah, I've taught that and taught a class on Trump and the media this past spring.
Oh, wow. Oh, I'd love to see the syllabus of that. Anyway, well, maybe we could have you come on again another time.
Sure.
But definitely, it was great to have you here. And thank you so much for your time. It was a lot of fun. Well, fun, fun that we were able to talk about this and not go nuts. And thank you, Dimitri, for your opinions. They're always, of course, good to keep us left-wingers in line here, baby. Anyway, you take it easy, David. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Take
Guys,
care.
thanks for coming. Bye-bye.